Hello and welcome to the Kentucky CDBG Grant Administrator Certification Training. My name is Kate Steger with ICF and I will be your webinar host for this morning. Before we begin, I will be going over a few logistics. The webinar is currently being recorded, and as a reminder, all participants are currently in listen-only mode. However, there are two ways to submit your questions for today. The WebEx toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen will contain the chat box and the Q&A. If you do not see either the chat box or the Q&A, please look to the bottom right-hand corner and click on the three dots to bring up the correct tool that you're missing, and it will appear in the panel of your WebEx toolbar. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please submit them through the chat box and please send them directly to the host. I will work with you to resolve those issues. For any and all content-related questions, please enter them through the Q&A box to all panelists. Your questions will be answered throughout the webinar. I would also like to let you know that if you would like to, you can print the slide handouts if you haven't already. There has been an updated link that was sent in the calendar invites. I would like to now turn it over to Les to begin our presentation. Les?
Good morning. Thanks, Kate. So welcome, everybody. We've got a large group and we've got a lot of ground to cover. But I wanted to start out by introducing Billy Johnson and let Billy welcome you officially. Billy?
Thank you, Les, and thanks for coming and helping us do this class. It looks like there is about 82 participants on today, so we want to thank everybody for signing up to take the CDBG administrative course. Also, this is a prerequisite for those of you are going to be taking disaster recovery later on during the first week of June. So we want to thank everybody for participating. If you have not signed up for that, this is the prerequisite for this course. So we welcome you to take part in that. There still is time to sign up for those. I can probably go ahead and introduce staff that are on here. You will see Jennifer Peters. She is the branch manager here for our Office of Federal Grants, and she does our public facilities section. As the week goes on, you will see Cole Sutton, Trey Greenwell, Travis Weber, and also Gabe Nickel on this as well. If you all have any questions, I'm sure they will tell you the logistics on how to raise your hand or put something in the chat. If I left anybody off from my staff, I can't tell who else is on. But anyway, thank you all so much for attending, and I'm going to go off on video and listen just as well. And if you all have any questions, feel free to put those in the back to you, Les.
Great. Thank you. So I also want to start with some introductions of our crew that are going to be on. Oh, and I could move the slide. That would be good. So Catherine's actually going to be joining us on Wednesday. We've changed the order a little bit. You'll see that Chapter 2, which is environmental review, is the only thing that we're doing out of order. Catherine isn't available today or tomorrow, so you'll meet her on Wednesday morning. But I'm really pleased to have Andalyn Nesbitt Rodriguez on as my co-trainer for much of this. Andalyn, do you want to do an introduction?
Sure. Thank you, Les. Hi, everybody, and thank you all for coming. My name is Andalyn Nesbitt Rodriguez. Been with ICF for about 2 years, but I've been in the community development field for about 15 years. I started out working for nonprofits and developers, a few actually, and then moved over to the city of Columbia, South Carolina. So that's where I'm coming from. I've done a lot of a lot of CDBG, environmental review, and fair housing. So very happy to be here. I'll turn it back over to you, Les.
Perfect. So I'm Les Warner. I have been around for a long time. Actually, my first day with ICF, which is ICF is a consulting firm that's based in Virginia, but folks are around the country like Andalyn and myself. I'm in southern Georgia on the coast right on the Florida border. So it's already hot 80 degrees, sort of more summery sort of weather here. My background, I've been working on this for 15 years. My first day on the job with ICF was at the DLG training, I think in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And so I've been working on CDBG and home and Section 3, Uniform Relocation Act, led a whole number of things. And prior to joining ICF, I worked at the state level. So I headed up the state of Ohio's community development and housing programs and was there for 20 years, did a short stint as a development director for a nonprofit. You've got a good sort of cross section of experience, and we'll be working with you trying to explain these rules, what they mean for you in your day-to-day job. And we're going to be focusing throughout this on this handbook that has been produced by DLG. That really is the sort of the go-to guide for all the details that you'll need to understand, for all the sample documents and attachments. And so that's going to be the focus as we go through this training. So if we were able to be in a room together, we'd be going around and introducing folks and learning a little bit about you. So we don't really have the ability to do that. So we're going to start out with just some poll questions just to get a little bit of information about the folks that are in the room. So as the polls come up, a separate poll box will come up with your options to be able to respond to those. And so as they open up, if you will click on your answer, hit the submit button, we'll pause for a couple seconds or a little bit just to let those roll up, and then we will be able to kind of see what we find from the group. So our first question is just to try to get a feel for how new is all of this to you with the CDBG Community Development Block Grant requirements. And I will say there's a lot of acronyms we're going to be using. Andelin and I will really work to try to make sure that we spell those out the first number of times on that. So we want to know, are you brand new to this? Is this completely new? Do you have some knowledge of CDBG, but you're now making sure that you know all of the details and getting ready for that certification exam? Or are you using this more as a refresher, or maybe you simply need to get certified? So if you'll go ahead, and I don't know if Kate, are the polls already up at this point? Okay. If you'll go ahead and make your selection, hit the submit button, then we will be able to get the results. Wow, that was good. All right. So as we would expect, most folks are brand new to this, and that's kind of the intent here. We're going to go through all the nitty gritty details, and also make sure you know where to look to go back and look at the additional details. We're going to try to help you fit those all together. For those of you that have a little more working knowledge, I would suggest, use that as sort of a refresher to test, do I understand this? What are the parts of this? So then wanted to get sort of a little bit of a temperature on the room on how folks are feeling about the certification exam. So, are you feeling anxiety about that? It's an open book test, and so you're kind of okay, or you're like, let's get this on. Give me the test right now. Let me do it. So if you'll go ahead and mark your answer and hit submit. I think the polls are just about to close here. There they are. They've ended. All right. So I think most of you are going to have some anxiety on this. That's really normal. And so we're going to be talking about the details of the exam, but Andela and I are going to be shameless on giving you hints about, like if Andelin says, well, this is very important, I'd be making a note, I'd be making a mark, because we really want, our goal here is to not only have you have a good working understanding of all these requirements, but we want you, when you take the exam on Thursday, to be like, oh, wait, I remember Angela made a big deal about this. I know where to look. I understand what what this is about. So we will try to lower that anxiety as we go along. So let's talk a little bit about the training, the goal of the training. As I mentioned, we want to make sure that everybody has a good working understanding of those key rules and requirements that are related to Community Development Block Grant. You all are taking this training course in preparation for taking that grant administrator certification. We need to make sure that you as a grant administrator, and you may be part of a larger team, but we need to make sure that there's some basic level of knowledge that's in place, because you're going to have some responsibilities, and so we need you to understand that. So we're going to be talking a lot of different topics. We're going to be talking about what the HUD CDBG rule is. We'll also be talking about, for Kentucky, for the DLG specific rules for Kentucky CDBG requirements and the process that goes with that. And that will include things like, the form that we would expect you to use as part of completing whatever that task was, so that you'll be familiar with what all those requirements are. And you'll notice as we go along, we're really following along the chapters in the handbook itself. And I did put in the chat box the link for the handbook if you've not already become familiar with that. And you'll see that for all of our topics as we talk through these, it is based on the chapter and the attachments that might go with that chapter. And so you can, on any one of those, go to the chapter, read the rest of the detailed information, access the forms that we may have referenced as part of that. And so we want you to have that working knowledge and be ready to do your job. But as part of that, we also want to make sure that you're prepared for the exam on this so that you can be certified on this. And as Billy mentioned, because of the disasters that have occurred in Kentucky, there is now CDBG disaster funding. And so there will be a separate disaster training that's happening, I believe, the first week of June. And so some of you, based on the communities you're working in, will also be needing to be certified for the CDBG DR funding on that. And so this training really is the prerequisite on that, because we're going to be talking about, what we're covering this week are all the normal rules that apply with CDBG. When you are working with the disaster funding, it will be all of what we've talked about this week, plus some rules, some requirements and steps that are going to be specific to working with disaster funding. So it's really important that if you're going to be working with the disaster funding and getting that certification, that you are well prepared by doing well with this certification process also, because you're going to need all of that to work with those disaster funding. So in the training link that was sent to you, and a fresh one was sent this morning, there is the agenda for our 3 days of training. We're going to be starting at 8:30 each day. These are going to be kind of long days, but we're going to try to make them as interactive and interesting as possible on this. A lot of information that, for folks that are new, it does tire the brain to try to process all of this. But we're going to provide you good references that you can go back. And we're going to be talking about, at the end of each day, we really recommend that you do some review after maybe you've stepped away from the training. And so you have the agenda. We provided the link for the KCDBG handbook, and you will see that each of our sections over the next 3 days are referencing a specific chapter in that handbook. And so I highly recommend, some of you may want to try to follow along on the slide handouts and the handbook at the same time. I don't think I could probably do that, but I highly recommend that after the training that you look through your notes, look through the slides, and then go through those handbook chapters, look at the attachments that are related to that. So we sent, as part of your invitation, and we sent it out again this morning, the slide handbook handout packet. So I really recommend that you print those out. You'll see that they have each of the slides and then have a section to be able to put notes. That would be a really good way to be able to capture, we're going to be making a point about some of these key points, things you particularly need to take another look at, be feeling comfortable about that information. So I would really encourage you to use those slide handouts to be able to make further notes. And then we're trying to get you prepared for Thursday's test with that. All right. Let's move ahead. And I will just warn you, I have hopefully this will not occur, but I have a rescue cat that is living in my office. And as Billy and others know, sometimes he makes an appearance and shoves his face in the camera. So I'm hoping that won't happen while we're together. But if it does, don't be alarmed. It's not Godzilla. It's just a rescue. All right. So with the agenda, you'll see that we're going to be taking mid-morning and mid-afternoon breaks. We have a good break for lunch, so you can kind of step away from this, try to refresh yourself a little bit on that. We have here on silencing your electronic devices, well, really, we have you muted. So we don't really have to worry about that, but I still think it's valid in that anything you can do to be less distracted will help you to capture more of this information and be better prepared for the exam. We are recording these sessions, and so we will be sending out a link either within maybe an hour or so after today's session, or at latest by the following morning. So if you were, wanting as part of your preparation that it would be helpful to go back and listen to a section on this, there will be recordings that would be available for you. We're also going to be doing end of the day quizzes. So trying to give you a feel for what might it be like, what might that exam be like. The quizzes are pretty good indication of the exam, and also will give you a feel for do you know where to find things? Do you know how to look things up? And there was a question, or I think a chat that just popped up. Yeah, the handbook is not, there's not a new update for this year. Oh, here's our cat. And so, yeah, that is the current handbook, and that's what you'll be using, and also what the training is based on. All right. So just a little bit of background on this. So the rule or process that was put in place quite a number of years ago by Kentucky was to make sure that all grant administrators are going to be certified. And so, as I said, trying to make sure that there is a level of competence and basic knowledge and skills, which are essential to be successful in administering a CDBG program. Keep in mind this goes with you. So this is a credential. We're hoping you don't get the credential and then move on, but it is a credential that is held in your name, not the agency. So it is something that hopefully will build your professional skills and be able to document that. So we're going to be doing a training for 3 days, and then there will be exam on Thursday morning. And after this certification, to maintain that certification, there will be what we call advanced trainings or ongoing training, so that certified administrators can stay up to date, stay current on issues. So for instance, I think last year when we did the advanced training, it was on section 3, which the rules had been revised. We needed to make everybody, make sure that everybody was up to speed on those new rules. Also, those ongoing continued training will focus on areas that we're seeing that there are compliance issues on that. So once you have the certification in place, then to maintain that, you'll need to participate in those advanced trainings. And as we mentioned, you know, the reason that this is in place is to make sure that everybody has that basic knowledge that's necessary to be successful in administering programs. So let's talk a little bit about the exam. So to be certified, you need to get at least a 70% score on the exam. And it is open book, and that also includes your notes. So you'll see us as we go through this talking about, okay, so if I say something is particularly important, let's say you get an exam question and it's about Davis-Bacon wage rates. You could look at your slides from that section, and you will not only have the slide information, but you'll have some notations that you made as we went through that section. So that might be your first go-to spot if you didn't know the answer off the top of your head. It's also open book, and since we have a chapter in the handbook that also is specific to that topic and goes into further detail, you also could look to the handbook and look through that and look up the answer, or maybe verify the answer that you think you know it, but you just want to be sure about that. And this is really kind of honing the technique that everybody uses as a administrator. I've been working with CDBG, I think maybe 35 years at this point. I still go back and look things up, go back to the regulations, go back to guidance that's been provided. And so it's teaching you a habit that you're going to need to maintain as you go along. Just double checking that you're following the current guidance, that you're using the right form. Just double check your memory on things. There will be a variety of question types. There are going to be some true false. There'll be some fill in the blank. There'll be some short answer sort of things or multiple choice. There are not, essay questions. My undergrad, I was a history major. I loved having essay questions because I could just keep writing and hopefully at some point I would stumble upon, part of the right answer. These are just going to be short answer. You don't need to write a book on that. The exam results will be provided within approximately 90 days for that. You do have the ability to ask for a review of your test after all of those exams have been scored. I think for the most part, my hope is that you all will have passed the exam and feel really good about that, but that you do have an option of requesting to be able to review that exam and maybe understand where you ran into troubles. So as part of the test preparation, as I've mentioned, listen to us, stay active in this training, stay engaged, take notes as we go along. And then as I keep mentioning, go back, look at those chapters where there's more detail that will help you, I think, kind of fill in the blanks kind of fit together all this information that you're trying to absorb. And so that, end of the day sort of review will be really helpful for you. We also, at the beginning of each day, will ask you, are there some questions from yesterday, things that as you looked over things the evening before, that you've got some questions about that, and we'll try to help you with those. We're going to be mentioning attachments and locations of where things are, and so pay attention to that. And then a lot of folks, you'll see that there is in the handbook, there's a table of contents, there is a glossary of terms, there's a list of attachments. So those may be really good resources to be able to use. For a lot of the test questions, the first challenge will be, okay, what's this topic relate to? Is this a labor question? Is this a procurement question? So that you kind of know, oh, I could look at my notes on that chapter. I can look in the handbook in that section. I would be looking, if it's a question about an attachment, I could look at that attachment list that relate to that particular topic. So using some of these tools may be helpful for you. And as I mentioned, there will be recordings available if you wanted to go back and listen to the verbal information on that. So things like that table of contents, the list of attachments, the glossary may be helpful for you. I would think some folks may print those out specifically and have those along with their slide handouts on this. So I think whatever works for you is good for that. So let's start with introducing some key terms. We will try to, as we hit these again in the regular content of this training, we'll try to sort of refresh what these are. But so you'll hear us talking about HUD. This is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's where the CDBG funds and the CDBG disaster funds are coming from. And so they've set the rules for the CDBG program. They've put out a lot of guidance over the years. And so they are also who is providing the funds to the state, and then the state in turn is then providing them to local communities around the state. And so the HUD rules, the HUD oversight is going to be really important. Those funds are flowing from HUD to DLG. And so DLG, you've met some of the staff members. You'll meet more of them as we go through this training. They're really your go-to source for questions specifically about the Kentucky CDBG program. When you have questions, when you need some guidance, we really encourage you to know who those folks are, to make contact with them, and call them early on rather than kind of guessing on things. You'll see throughout this we'll use the KCDBG term. So that's the Kentucky CDBG program and funding. So HUD sets up the rules for the CDBG funding, but then each state has put together a comprehensive plan and an action plan where they've determined how am I going to use these funds, what are the rules that are going to apply specifically for the Kentucky CDBG funds. And so it's really important that you understand what the KCDBG funds are requiring, and this handbook is really your best resource on this and the training that we're providing you. So when we talk about a grantee is a, let me look, Andelin just sent me a chat here. So yeah, the training is for grant administrator certification, but the participants are working for local grantees as opposed to working for DLG, which is the state office for this. So when we talk about grantee, that's Most of you are either working for a grantee directly, or you might be working for an ad that's going to be administering funds that were received by that grantee. So cities, counties would be the grantees on this. For the state CDBG funds, the requirement is that the state cannot generally fund things directly, that those funds have to go to a unit of general local government, which they call UGLUGs. And so money has to go to a city or a county. And then the grantee might have a subrecipient that's going to be working with them and helping to administer that. When we talk about a beneficiary, that's the end recipient on this. And we have a lot of variety. So we might be talking about, maybe we're putting a water line through a neighborhood. So the beneficiaries are going to be folks that live in those units that are being able to tap into this new water line and now have potable, safe water that they're going to be able to use. Other cases, it might be a homeowner or a renter that's going to be able to occupy a unit that was assisted with the CDBG funds. It could be a for-profit business, an economic development project that's receiving CDBG funds, and there also will be beneficiaries of individuals that are going to be able to either get a job or maintain a job because of that investment of the CDBG funds in that particular project. You'll also hear us talking about low income and low and moderate income individuals. And we'll talk about national objectives in a little bit and the fact that these funds are really tied, most of our funds are going to be tied to benefiting folks who are income qualifying. So low and moderate income, we're talking about 80% or below of area median income. And for low income, these are households or individuals that are at 50% or below of area median income. We'll talk more about that, but I'm just introducing these key terms. We'll also be talking about an ERR, which is the Environmental Review Record. And so on Wednesday morning, we're going to be going into a lot of detail about the environmental review process, the importance of that, and what's in that ERR that we'll be exploring. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and jump into our first section. Angela, do we have some questions that have come through we should address?
None so far.
Okay,
So
perfect.
we'll go straight into project administration.
All right.
All right, so project administration, starting, at the beginning with the grant award procedures. So the way that this works is communities will first apply to DLG, Department for Local Government. Submitting a funding application is going to either result in a notice of an award or a notice of non-selection. So if you're selected to receive a grant, then the grantee would be sent a preliminary approval letter, and that begins the process of setting up the grant, ensuring that all the documents and evidentiary support is in place. So DLG is going to issue a preliminary approval that's going to hold the funds. That letter will announce the award. It's going to detail the amount of the award and offer instructions on how the grantee needs to proceed and their next steps. So if the grantee accepts those terms outlined in that preliminary letter, there are a few things that should happen. So this grantee CEO should sign and return that offer. DLG is going to hold a grant agreement meeting with the grantee CEO, other key parties to discuss the agreement, clear up any questions that may have arisen. Once the grantee refused that agreement, they should go ahead and review that with their legal counsel. At that point, the grantee would copy the agreement and send 2 copies of that signed agreement back over to DLG. DLG is going to process the agreement through the state approval system. They're going to sign that agreement and then send one it'll at that time be fully executed because both sides would have signed, and they'll send one fully executed copy back to the grantee for their records. So that's kind of the process of the grant award procedures. As you go through the grant award, you will be collecting evidentiary materials. And I'm sorry, I don't have the ball right now to be able to move the slide.
Hold on just a moment and I will
Great,
hopefully.
I got it. Thank you
Oh,
so
good.
much. All right.
Thank
So
you, Kate.
during that grant award process, there are some evidentiary materials that are going to Kentucky will require as a part of the grant. So those include the environmental review documents and tear sheets. We're going to get way deeper into environmental review on Wednesday, but you might know that no HUD funds can be spent without an environmental review record. So that those documents are really important. You're not supposed to take any choice limiting actions, which actions that limit your choice. And so spending funds typically is a choice limiting action in most cases. All right. Other materials are firm commitments for the other funds. If you're layering funds, then commitments for those funds as well, so that you have a complete project and you know that it's going to debt service. You'll need approval of your budget ordinance. An anti-displacement or relocation assistance plan would be needed if there's going to be some chance of displacement. And I think Les will get into that later on in the training when he covers the Uniform Relocation Act or URA. You'd need a copy of the approved KCDBG procurement code, authorized signature form, so a form saying who is authorized to sign for actions on the grant. You'll also need an electronic transfer funds form. This is going to be a part of how you receive your funds. Other materials, a fair housing resolution must be signed, and I think we'll get into that a little bit later on, but that is one of those important points that Les was talking about earlier. Grantees are required to pass a fair housing resolution, and so you might want to take note of that. All right. Section 504 evaluation and plan. This is accessibility for mobility impaired people living with mobility impairment. So you have to have a way to make sure that everybody has access and that there are no um, barriers to access for people who are living with disabilities, and that any spaces that people might visit must be evaluated, and if necessary, a plan to correct those barriers. All grantees must have a policy of non-discrimination. That's part of, we're still going through these evidentiary materials. Um, Applicant recipient disclosure form, cost overrun resolution, just in case costs do run over. You'll need your state clearinghouse assurance and comments, any legally binding commitments. Of course, this is all part of what goes into the grant agreement, and then what you keep in your files is that fully executed grant agreement that we just talked about a few minutes ago that DLG is going to send back after the grant agreement is executed. And then any other documents as needed, possibly a loan or lease agreement, um, security documents if they're applicable to the project, a submission of a certification by legal counsel related to any of these documents if it's necessary as well. And then submit a request for release of funds. This is part of the environmental review process. And so again, we'll get to that, but very important that no choice limiting actions are made at all until you have that request for release of funds back from HUD. All right. So citizens participation. All jurisdictions, grantees are expected to take whatever actions are appropriate to encourage participation of all of its citizens. That includes minorities, limited people with limited English proficiency, people with um, living with disabilities. You have to make sure that you are allowing and encouraging all people who are going to be affected to have a part in and have their voices heard in your process. So there will be at least 2 public hearings that are required. There's a needs assessment prior to the application, so you're going to have a hearing and try to get the needs of the community from the community members. That's really important. And then a review of performance at closeout as well. You're going to need to provide notices of these hearings. So publish in the newspaper of the largest bona fide paid circulation at least 7 to 21 days prior to the hearing. You're going to need to post that in the newspaper and keep that tear sheet from the newspaper posting. That's really important. With HUD, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So no matter what you do, even if you, in addition to putting it on the website, I mean, in the newspaper, some people like to post it in the website, on the website. Um, in order to broaden public participation, some people are going to putting it on your social media, your agency's Facebook, LinkedIn. These are all really great things to do, but you must keep the tear sheets, keep the screenshots, show what you did, and so that your file can read like a book, so that everything is there in order and makes sense. All right, so public notices, you're going to want to put that in the newspaper, distribute to the public, and use a sample in the attachments of the handbook, which Les referred to earlier. Kentucky does have an amazing handbook. It answers most of the questions. I didn't have any questions that couldn't be answered through that handbook. So there are some attachments there, and a sample notice of public hearing is one of those attachments. All right, hearings. So we just talked about having these public hearings, getting information from the public in order to be able to back up why you're doing what you're doing, why you chose whatever activities you chose. The hearings must be held at a time and a place that are convenient to citizens in the project area. So when I was at the City of Columbia, for example, we would hold one hearing in the middle of the day and then one hearing in the evening, just to make sure that whether folks were working different shifts or whether they wanted to come during their working hours or whether they saw it as an after hours type of thing, we were trying to accommodate people. We held our public hearings close to bus lines so that people who didn't have transportation could easily get to those public hearings so that it was accessible for everyone. And we made sure that we held at least one meeting or public hearing in each of our smaller, we call them redevelopment areas. So things like that to really accommodate people. You also have to accommodate non-English speaking residents if applicable. This could be putting the limited English proficiency language in the public notice and saying if you need any assistance, then please call this number. And then if folks do need assistance, then you would take that other step to make sure that there are translators ready. The facility that you're holding the public hearings must be accessible to persons with disabilities. This is part of the 504 planning, but also just part of your citizens' participation and something that you have to really look out for at all times, making sure that everybody has access. All right. One thing to remember that you must summarize and respond to comments. So all the comments that you received, particularly if you have a public comment period, have to be kept, summarized, and responded to. So we took this comment into consideration and we made X, Y, and Z changes, or we took this comment into consideration, no changes were made because, and then the reason why, though given thorough thought, that suggestion wasn't applied. All right, so that's kind of an overview of citizens participation. It's a really important part of the structure of a program. All right, grievance procedures. Grantees must develop compliant grievance procedures. Um, You must respond to complaints within 15 working days. Complaints can either go to DLG or go to the grantee directly. If DLG does receive the complaint, they will send it to the grantee. The grantee has 15 working days to respond. You know, sometimes this is not practical, maybe just due to the nature of the project, particularly if it's construction and the complaint has, you know, something to do with going to happen in a few weeks or something that hasn't um, you can't address yet. So we're practical. You must address that within 15 working days. And you must send a copy of the resolution letter to DLG so that they can track that and have that with the complaint and make sure that everything was, all grievances were taken seriously. Each complaint and the resolution to the complaint should be well documented in the grantee's files, and kept in a project complaint file for any project related complaints. So that's an important part. We're going to get to a little bit record keeping, but grievance procedures, the complaint, and the resolution do have to be in the file. That's important. All right, conflict of interests. Conflict of interests are prohibited in procurement of goods and services, determining of beneficiaries, really in all aspects. When I first started in this,
Andolyn, I think you're going to want to move your slide.
oh, thank you, thank you. When I first started in this industry, my mentor used to say, "Does it pass the giggle test?" You know, like if you heard it, was it does it make sense? So conflict of interest is always important, and things always have to appear above board. Sometimes things can be above board, but not appear above board. So conflict of interest is really important. Persons covered may not gain financial benefit or interest. That includes employees, consultants, officers, a grantee or subrecipient. The beneficiaries themselves should not, you know, have a obvious obvious conflict of interest, and that has to be above board. Um, shouldn't be any family ties or business ties there. Um, there are some exceptions, and this is one of those things that Les pointed out earlier is important. So you might want to jot this down. Upon written request, DLG may review the provisions of a conflict of interest plan on a case-by-case basis, um, and may offer an exception. So if you are seeking an exception to a conflict of interest policy, you have to provide three things. You have to provide a disclosure of the nature of the conflict, accompanied by an assurance that there's been a public disclosure of a conflict, and there's a description of how the public disclosure was made. You have to include a certification that the affected person has withdrawn from him or her, his or her functions or responsibilities or the decision-making process. And you have to provide an opinion of the local government's attorney that the interest for which the exception is sought would not violate state or local law. So, to request an exception for a conflict of interest policy, you have to submit the disclosure of the nature of the conflict, a certification that that person has withdrawn themselves from any decision-making ability, and an opinion from the local government's attorney that that conflict of interest is not going to violate state or local law. So I'll give you an example. In Columbia, we had a city council person who was married to the head of a nonprofit, and this nonprofit did a lot of good work in the community. But each year, they had to each submit conflict of interest statements to the city of Columbia, who were the funder. Just again disclosing over and over again, we're married. She is the council person is going to recuse herself of any decision making responsibility with respect to any project or any HUD funding that's going to be used, and that worked, and it worked just fine, and HUD was satisfied. But sometimes things are necessary. There was nothing going on untoward, but you have to make sure that it passes the giggle test and that all the documentation is there. So really important for um, the conflict of interest.
And Angela, and I'll just mention on this, so you'll notice, oh, I just lost my big screen. That's not good. You notice that at the top of this, it talks about not only procurement of goods and services, but also that determining of beneficiaries. So sometimes that's something like, let's say we have someone who, I don't know, works in the parking meter department, and their mother is LMI, needs the services that are being provided by a particular program. So because we have a conflict of someone who's working for the city, we have a family member that might be applying for assistance, let's say to have her house rehabbed, that we have what would appear to potentially be a conflict of interest. So the workaround on that might be to be able to determine, well, the let's say the daughter who works for the city has absolutely no role in determining who's going to be eligible for that assistance. There was not some kind of early information. Maybe this was first come, first serve. So if your daughter is working and knows about this in advance before others in the general public. So being able to analyze that situation and provide the details that there was not some unintended advantage, that could be written up as part of the waiver on the conflict of interest on that. And so it's something that you really have to watch for throughout the program. I'll give you another example. We ran a downtown program that was doing downtown revitalization exteriors of buildings. They adopted a paint palette, a chart of paints that would have to be used. They were all from one manufacturer. The only paint store that sold that in town was owned and run by the mayor's wife. So, you do have to kind of keep an eye out for this. And of course, when you're working in small town, in a rural area, people are related or have inner relations on that. And so just being watchful for that becomes important.
Great. Thank you so much. There was a question that came up in the chat, and I wanted to go ahead and go back a slide to address that. Are there any HUD or DLG standards or requirements for the grievance procedure? There's lots of good information in the handbook that Les mentioned earlier. Particularly, there's attachment 10-9, which is a sample grievance procedure sample grievance procedure. So that's really good. There's some other information as well. So you might want to look at attachment 10.9 and in the handbook a little bit, and it might give you a little bit more information around those grievance procedure standards. Okay, and there's a that sample at 10.9 is really good. It's going to give you a lot of information. All right, I'm going to flip us forward again now. I hope that answered your question. If not, if you have a more specific question, then please put it in the chat and we'll make sure we can get to it. All right, so CDBG national objectives. All CDBG activities must meet one of the following national objectives. This is how you connect it back to CDBG is through these national objectives. So I can't stress how important these are. And again, might want to write it down, the CDBG national objectives. A CDBG activity must either benefit low and moderate income persons, and Les went over that a little bit earlier. That's from the 80% AMI, area median income range, on down is going to be that low to moderate income persons. I think moderate is 80, and then there's 50, which is low, and 30, which is very low income. The activity could aid in the prevention or elimination of slum or blight, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in a moment, or must meet an urgent need. So DLG determines an application, but the project must comply through its duration to continue to meet that national objective. So when you apply and you're awarded, DLG says, yeah, this meets the national objective, but if it doesn't continue to meet the national objective through the compliance period, then that would might cause repayment of funds. All right, so meeting a national objective. Again, there are three: slum and blight, urgent need, or benefit to low to moderate income persons. So we'll start with slum and blight. Slum and blight is not as not used as much as the benefit to low to moderate income persons, but very, very valid. This is where you're aiding in the prevention or elimination of slum or blight. So the activities, the areas have to meet the definition under Chapter 99 of Kentucky Revised Statutes, or KRS, um, and it must meet the definition of slum or blight under Chapter 99 there. The area must contain a substantial number of deteriorating or dilapidated buildings throughout. This is a little bit different in each state, but must contain a substantial number of deteriorated or dilapidated buildings. The activity must be designed to address one or more of the conditions that contributed to the deterioration, to stop that deterioration and thereby prevent or eliminate slum or blight. So you could do an individual structure by structure, that's a spot basis slumber blight, or you could do an area benefit. So this whole area has been deemed as slum or blighted, and so we're going to go through and try to uplift those. One time we did an activity to reduce slumber blight, where our code enforcement team was putting up this glass, not plexiglass, in windows so that it looked like people lived in houses that were vacant. There were a lot of vacant houses in this area. And so that really helped that area, and it started to look better. And then folks started buying, and it was the thing that kind of turned that neighborhood around. So slum and blight, national objective, that's an example. The area must be designated as slum or blight. Okay, urgent need. This one is, I think, the least used. This is a community development need having a particular urgency. And there are some parameters around that urgency. You can't just say, oh, this is really going to be helpful and it's needed right now, and so it's urgent. The conditions must pose a serious and imminent threat to the health or welfare of the community. It had to have happened recently, so the origins of this urgent need must have happened within the last 18 months or recently became urgent. And there must be no other funding source that can pay for the cure of that urgent need. So those are the kind of guidelines around urgent need. It has to be pose a serious and immediate threat to the health and welfare of the community, has to have happened in the last 18 months or have gotten significantly worse in the 18 months, last 18 months, and no other funds can be available to do this, to do the activity. An example of an urgent need, and I say you can't just say that it's urgent because I tried that once in my head and was told quickly that doesn't work. And I was trying to make the case for why this project or activity is really urgent, and that's just not the way it worked. But then we had, unfortunately, a flood in 2015 here in Columbia, South Carolina. It was a 100-year flood. It was really bad, and then I saw what an urgent need really is, and that is the situation where you would use that objective, that national objective. All right, then benefits to low to moderate income persons. This is really called the primary national objective because it's the one that is way more used. So the objective requires that 51% of the people benefiting from that activity are low to moderate income, or 80% of AMI or below. And you can do this based on an area benefit. So you can say, um, all, per these census tracts and the demographic information that we've gotten, um, over 51% of the people living in this area are low to moderate income, and that could qualify it. Or you could say, we're going to get income and income information from every person that uses this program to prove that over 51% of the people who are using this service or activity are low to moderate income. You could do that as well. You can also, if you're doing an activity where folks are presumed to be low to moderate income, you could qualify an activity as benefiting LMI persons based on that. An example of that, there are, I think, 7 groups of people who are presumed LMI by HUD. This includes uh, people who are homeless. So if you were doing something, a program at a transitions at a shelter, then that would be presumed that the people there are low to moderate income, for example. So I apologize, I'm not going to go through all 7 of those because I can't remember them for some reason right this minute. But if you Google presumed LMI by HUD, you'll certainly bring a list of those up. I know there are migrant workers, people who uh, are literate.
Severely disabled adults. We also have homeless, which you mentioned.
People who have been abused.
Senior citizens
Hmm.
are part of that also. So we don't really see those used a lot with the KCDBG programs, but it essentially means that instead of having to be able to document individuals' income, that you can say, oh, because they are part of this presumed group, you would be able to simply document that who was being served by that particular project. So for instance, if you were running a water line to a domestic abuse shelter, they qualify as one of the presumed groups. And so you would be able to describe how this particular investment of CDBG helped that specific group. That would be how you would meet your national objective with that. So you wouldn't need to then go to individual residents of that shelter and be able to and have to ask for income information on that. And it's really generated based on looking at data, existing data, that would show that generally folks who are in these populations are going to be LMI, so we're able to make that presumption. And I will just add one thing to that. There is, you kind of have to use the sniff test on that. So you could be challenged on that presumption. So for instance, I was in a community where they had used CDBG funds for the Senior Citizen Center. And this was a very affluent neighborhood, and the parking lot was filled with Mercedes and Jaguars. And a citizen could certainly have challenged and said, I don't know that I believe that this particular facility actually is generally serving folks that are at 80% and below, and they would have needed to have generated, maybe done a survey of those participants. So keep in mind, it still has to have that logical sort of sniff test related to it.
Thank you. And we got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to stop right now because I think this is pertinent to what we're talking about right now. So when you say throughout the duration, does that mean in perpetuity? I think that what you're asking, I was saying that DLG will qualify you as having an activity as having met a national objective at application, but you still have to continue to meet that national objective throughout the compliance period of the program. For CDBG, the compliance period is 5 years. So unless otherwise stated by DLG for a longer period, sometimes funders do that. I haven't seen that a lot with CDBG. The CDBG compliance period is 5 years, and that's how long you have to keep it meeting a national objective and keep documenting that it meets the national objective. Okay, do funding caps apply to urgent need projects? Not that I am aware of. Les?
Well, you have an overall restriction of your CDBG funding a percentage needing to benefit LMI. And
That's
so
100%.
urgent need is not, within that calculation, either is slum and blight. If you were to look nationally at the use of CDBG funds, I think the last thing I heard was, 96%, 98% of CDBG funds are being used meeting one of the LMI national objectives. An awful lot of CDBG funds, particularly for states, are being used for infrastructure projects, which are going to be on an area benefit basis. And so you would have to keep in mind how you're going to meet that set aside for the low income benefit. And frankly, DLG is going to be handling that calculation. That's not something that a local grantee has to determine and track.
Thank you
But
so much.
it does limit how much you could, as you know, DLG could choose to say, well, let's do an all slum and blight program. They couldn't do that because the slum and blight does not meet this set aside for LMI persons.
Yeah.
So that's part of their design in their programs.
Les, may I chime in for a second?
Please.
I'm not for sure, but Caitlin, are you asking about the caps because we have caps on our applications? So I wondered if that's what she's referring to there. Like could an application come in, like for CDBG for a water line or sewer line, it's a 1.25 million is the max that they can request in their application. So I wondered if that's what she's referring to as caps. So
That makes sense.
my
And
answer there would more than likely be yes, they would apply,
Yep.
but they could always reach out to us to discuss.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so
Can I
that
ask? Could I ask for more than 1.25 million if my water line is urgent? That
Like I said, we could discuss that. That would be, and two, you'd have to meet all the urgent need criteria.
So I think what this is a good example of is that I mentioned that there are CDBG rules, and then each direct recipient, the state, is then for their program as part of their action plan is laying out, okay, I'm budgeting this, I'm setting aside a certain amount for, I'm doing infrastructure, I'm doing certain activities, and they've laid out then what those minimums or maximums might be, how much a grantee could apply for. There might be a limit on how much per unit you could expend on housing. So the things that are set by the state has the ability to review, and they could choose to waive those. The things that are set in place by HUD, they don't have the ability, the state would not have the ability to make a modification on that. So having that conversation with DLG and figuring out, is this something they can and that it makes sense for them to adjust will be important.
all right. Thank you guys. Thanks so much. Keep those questions coming. That's what we want to be able to answer as many questions as we can. So, all right, let's move on to record keeping.
Actually, before we do that, can we mention just a couple of other things on that?
Can I go back?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wanted to mention here is that under area benefit, particularly for infrastructure projects and in rural areas, when we look at that benefit for the area, it is only, we're going to be able to count only those that can actually benefit from that. So we oftentimes will have a water line that's going through an area, and on most area benefit things, we might look at the census information and be able to say, well, this is a LMI census tract, at least 51% of the population are LMI. We'd be able to print out that information and then be able to handle it in that way. But when we get into infrastructure projects in rural areas, we oftentimes have where, that water line is maybe available for folks in only a portion of that census block group. And so in some cases, when we go to document area benefit, we can't use the census information and would have to do a survey, which essentially would be identifying who in this area is able to benefit from this infrastructure project that we're putting through, and then be able to collect the data based on only those in that population that have the ability to tap in. So that can be a complicated process to try to deal with that. And I will just mention, we're not going into a lot of detail on this, but it's important to understand that there is a survey methodology that is part of the regulations with guidance. So you would determine what's the population for this particular path that my water line is going through. And then with that, there's essentially a random sampling protocol. So you wouldn't have to go to all 500 of those households that were potentially beneficiaries of this, but you could, with a random sampling methodology, it would set out a specific number of responses that you would need to get. And with that, then you would be reaching out to that specific number. So maybe out of the 500, maybe it's, I don't know, 100 households. Let's use nice round numbers. And we would need to then be able to show that at least 51% of those households qualify as LMI. They'd be doing a self-declaration as part of that. And so in some cases, we have folks that, you might send out 100 surveys and maybe you only get back 50 responses from that. You can't simply look at the 50 responses and say, well, I've got at least 51% that were LMI. Your sample size is 100, and so there are replacement sample households that need to be selected. So there's a whole methodology on this. So if you had a project that was going to include having to do a survey, you would work in conjunction with DLG. They're going to guide you on this. They're going to help make sure that you are following that prescribed methodology, because for each of these national objectives, the key here is that for these funds to be an eligible use of CDBG and not be subject to have to, repay the funds, we need to know that we've met that national objective. In these cases where we're doing a survey, it's the survey that has to be found to be valid. And so it's really important that you work with DLG, and they're going to work with you to make sure that with this process that you've gone through, that you've safely followed that protocol. And if HUD were to select that file, that they would agree with the conclusion that you came up with, and that would document this as being an eligible use of funding. All right.
Thank you. So yeah, I know Les said it, and Jennifer put it in the chat, but just wanted to say it one more time. Prior to surveying, always contact DLG. Okay, very important. All right, thank you so much. We're going to move forward here to record keeping. It's really important that the grantee establish a good record keeping system to be in compliance with the regulations. So this includes maintaining comprehensive records and submitting all of the necessary reports. The filing system should be easy to use and provide a historic account of activities and be available to the state auditors, to HUD, surely the Inspector General, if needed, Comptroller General. It goes on and on, of course, to DLG itself. So your record keeping system should show compliance, document progress, The grantee is responsible for the files, so that's really, really big. In HUD world, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So if that file or your filing system does not read like a book, where someone could sit down 5 years later, or someone who doesn't know the program very well could sit down, but everything makes sense and everything is well documented, then you're good to go. That's what you're looking for there. So if the ADD, area developmental districts, I know you guys know that, are going to keep the files, they do need to be available to the public. If there are any PII in the file, if there's any beneficiary information, then those would need to be available to the HUD, to DLG, the Inspector General, entities like that, but not necessarily to the public. So you must maintain files for at least 5 years after project closeout. So 5 years after the project is closed out. So not from when you first submit it, but after the project is closed out. Again, keep all personal information in secure locations with control access. So locked fireproof cabinets is what I think is a standard here. So, all right, we have come to the end of this chapter.
And I'll just add one more thing, I think, on the records keeping. So, the key here is to plan in advance of what is it when I'm doing this particular activity, what are all the documents that I need to have in place. And so in the handbook itself, there is not only a file list in chapter 1, as you see in this, but with the other chapters. And so in advance, planning out, okay, so if I'm running an economic development project, these are the things that I need to be collecting that will need to be in that file and need to be maintained. So kind of planning in advance for that, thinking about when does that become available? Who is the person that's going to be responsible for pulling that document, and then having some kind of probably a sampling process to just double check to see that all of those files are actually in place. I think that's particularly when you're doing something that's new on some of those early files, making sure that this is actually the person that's doing the interaction with the client or the business is actually following that. Just kind of double checking your file system from time to time. And then we're going to be talking at the end of this training about the closeout process. And Andelin just mentioned about, those files need to be in place for 5 years after project closeout. That would be, again, a good time to double check that file, make sure that things aren't in somebody's desk or kind of moved around. Sometimes people are pulling things out of files while they're working on things. So making sure that everything is tucked back in that file where it goes. A lot of times folks will take those files for closed out projects and move them somewhere physically if you're doing paper files so that they are protected, so that we no longer have things disappearing. There was a question about electronic files, and I do think that that's becoming the new standard on this. A couple things on that. HUD, the advice had been that HUD needed to essentially approve, and I think at this point that's probably been pretty much covered, that you need to be able to generate those files for them, either being able to print them out or be able to view them. But in some cases, you might need to think about essentially disabling those files so they can't be altered after the fact. So for instance, when I worked at the state level, when we would go through a review process and determining in a competitive funding who was going to receive funding, we kind of locked down those records once that process had been completed, so that there was not this issue of, I think you've tampered with, I think you've changed in some way on that. So, I mean, the same security sorts of things would apply. And then also thinking about at the end of this, so we've talked about files need to be maintained at least 5 years after closeout. If you have paper documents, then making sure that they are appropriately disposed of once they are able to be disposed of. Jennifer, you want to add to
No, I
that?
think we're good there.
Okay.
We are doing a little bit more electronic stuff here lately, but yeah. So yeah, as long as you keep everything to where they cannot access the PII, because that's just a big thing anymore. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And I will say I had a community that they were unlucky enough to have a HUD IG, a HUD Inspector General visit, which is never a good thing. And they had files that they had in storage that should have been disposed of, that shouldn't have still existed. And as part of the HUD Inspector General looking around, they came across these old files that should have been disposed of, and they questioned then the use of some of the funding. Well, unfortunately, part of the files had been disposed of, which had key information that would have documented eligibility and national objective on that. So make sure that, not only you're keeping it for the period of time that needs to be in place, but then properly disposing it, because under freedom of information requirements, if you have that if you still have that information, it needs to be produced. And so we need to make sure that we know what public records we have, what ones we're required to maintain, and then let them go when they can be disposed of, just to kind of keep your sanity. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a suggestion here about with their digital files, having them labeled well so that you can clearly identify what that file is without going through and opening each one of those. That's a good suggestion. All right, so this brings us to the end of this section. I would guess that there are some folks thinking, boy, I need another cup of coffee or some chocolate. And so we're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back. Let's go ahead and be back at 10:15. We'll give you just a little bit longer, run to the restroom, get something to eat, and then we'll start in on our financial management section. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you got everything done you needed to get done. So we're going to switch gears. We're moving into chapter 3, which is financial management. And so, when you look at the handbook itself, you will be able to then follow along as you're reviewing, looking at the details on what we're going to cover in the slides, but also there are 8 attachments that are as part of this chapter, and we'll be referencing some of those. So, as you think about test taking strategy, again, if you had a question that seemed to relate to an attachment, you could look at that attachment list, see what your options were, and double checking that. So just trying to get you familiar with kind of how things lay out and where you might find things if you needed to double check them. So what are we talking about when we talk about financial management? So we have, I would think most of you will have multiple open grants at any given time. You might have a couple of years of CDBG funding, but a lot of you will have, you might have CV funding, the COVID funding that came through. Some of you will be working with disaster funding also. And of course, a lot of you have a whole number of different sources of funds that are being administered by the same agency, by the same staff. So being able to keep an eye on and track each of those individual grants, the money coming in, money going out, being able to have the appropriate documentation in place to make sure that it was an eligible expense, that it was charged within program requirements and limits to the right grant, and that you know at any given point, what's the status on this. So what's required is that the grantee would have an accounting system and some internal controls in place to be able to track all those funds, all of the entries and exits of funds from those accounts. We're also going to be talking, I think, in the next chapter about procurement. And so when things are being purchased, when some kind of contracting is being done, then there's a specific set of rules that will apply, and there'll be different rules depending on the amount of funding, the type of activity that you're undertaking. And so also having good data, good information about the procurement process would be important as part of that. Within CDBG funds themselves, we have sets of rules about what is an eligible use of CDBG, what would be ineligible. There are some categories where it might identify this would be eligible, but only in these circumstances. So we have program-specific requirements. We also have overarching federal requirements, or the circulars. You're going to hear us talking about 2 CFR Part 200. And that's the federal circular that lays out all of that information about what is expected in that accounting system that you would have in place. Procurement, what costs are eligible versus ineligible. So for instance, one of the things that's ineligible is entertainment. So, if you were holding your public hearing and you wanted to get a lot of folks to show up, if you could have like chicken wings and beer or something, that would probably really help with the turnout. But unfortunately, that's not going to be eligible. So at all points, making sure that we know that this is a cost that's allowable under CDBG regulations and under the federal circular, the 2 CFR Part 200, but also allocability. So I'll use the dining in a restaurant example. So if Andalyn and I go out to dinner and we order some appetizers and I pretty much eat all of them, when we get to the point where we're going to divvy up the bill, it's probably not fair for Andalyn to pay for half of the hors d'oeuvres when I ate them all. And so it's that what's the appropriate share of this cost that should be allocated to me. So that might be, examples of that would be like the space that your offices are occupying. If you're paying rent, then, and let's say you are working on CDBG and you also have, I don't know, home funds. So that same space is being used by 2 programs. A portion of that cost for the rent for that space would be allocable to the CDBG program. Other portions of that would be allocated to something else. And so having that documentation, having a financial system in place that shows how did I decide that this was the appropriate amount to bill to this versus another thing. That would be the same when we talk about, excuse me, about your labor costs. So Andalyn and I, for instance, work on a whole bunch of different projects. And so we have a code for each individual project. And when we fill out our timesheets, we're billing in half-an-hour increments. And it's based on what was I doing from 1 to 1:30, what did I do from 1:30 to 2? That all is tracked so that there's a documentation to be able to show how we allocated those costs. We'll talk more about that, but those are the sorts of things that are captured in that financial management system on, is it an eligible cost? Is it the fair share appropriate part of that? We're also going to be talking about audit requirements, and that's part of the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements. And then we've mentioned a little bit about personally identifiable information, PII, and making sure that part of that financial management system is also protecting that information that you might be collecting as part of your processing. We're also going to, at the end of this section, be talking about program income. So we'll define what is that, what are all the rules that apply on that. Here we go. All right. So here are regulatory references that I've been talking about. So we've got the CDBG regulations at 24 CFR. So when you see CFR, that's Code of Federal Regulations. So this is how we locate it. So it's at 24 CFR Part 570. That's where all the CDBG regulations are. So you know if somebody's referencing, well, you can't do that because of 570-201B, you know they're referencing CDBG regulations versus home or some other regulation. So those are the program funding specific regulations that HUD applies, that DLG has to follow, and those would be referenced in your grant agreement. So you have to follow those as part of implementing your CDBG funds in your local community. But we also have 2 CFR Part 200, which is the federal circular. It's not specific to the CDBG program that applies to federal funding. Keep in mind, you could have other layers of requirements. We've got, local governments have to follow KRS, the Kentucky Revised codes that are going to apply. And you could have at your local level, you could have a county requirement that you've added something above and beyond that's going to be specific for your local community. So we always need to make sure that we're following the program requirements, the federal requirements, and then Kentucky specific or local requirements that would apply to that. So as part of that, we need to have a financial management system, which is going to ask those particular questions as we're going through this process to make sure things are eligible and appropriate, and we have a paper trail to be able to document that. And so those internal controls need to be in place, and that's things like would include things like separation of duties. So you generally will see that when we are drawing funds, so when you in a local community are going to draw funds from DLG, they're going to be drawing the money from HUD. We want to see that the person that created the voucher that's putting together that bill is not doing that without another set of eyes. So we would have someone doing the voucher, and then we'd have a second person who'd be signing off, reviewing that and signing off. So we have a little bit of sort of a safety there on that. And so that's when we talk about separation of duties, we're trying to make sure that we don't have one person who has complete control and nobody's aware of what's going on. I always have bad stories that I can tell on pretty much every topic. So I had a community where I came into the office and I got an early morning call that the county auditor had attempted to commit suicide. And I think at that point was not conscious, and they weren't sure whether they would regain consciousness. But the big immediate question then was, is that, are there funds missing? If there are funds missing, whose funds might be missing? And so there was a lot in place on that. We want to make sure that we don't have one person who kind of without any other oversight is able to do things and perhaps do things inappropriately where there's no one to be able to catch that. So we want those internal controls in place, and we need to have that paper trail, the documentation in place to be able to document each step that was taken. We would expect that folks would have policies and procedures that would say, okay, when I am creating a voucher, it's this person's going to do it, then this person is going to be signing off on that. I would expect that there's documentation so we can see when the voucher was created, when it was reviewed and signed off, so that we're following that protocol that's in place, and that would include, financial reportings as part of that. And at the end of this, essentially, or ongoing incrementally, are audits, which are conducted from time to time, that look not only at individual transactions and test those to make sure that they're within the requirements, but also audits look at those financial systems and make sure that they are adequate, that they are being followed, because we want to make sure that those are going to catch any issue that falls with that. In my role at the state, I would get the reports that came from the state auditors that had gone to grantees, nonprofits that were receiving funding. And the most common audit finding I would see would be not necessarily that the use of funds wasn't eligible, but there wasn't enough documentation in that file to show what those funds were being used for. And so it's not just that we can track that we got an invoice and we made a payment on it, but what are we paying for? How is it related to my CDBG program? Is it the right grant that I'm billing this to? Are these costs something that's directly related to that? Should some portion of that be paid by somebody else? So having that documentation in place, if that's not in place, then an audit is going to question those costs and may require repayment unless you can produce the adequate documentation to show that it's eligible and been appropriately allocated. So having those systems in place, making sure that they're being followed, is really critical to not having question costs and having repayments that have to be made. So we want to make sure that our financial management system is recording all of those transactions, that we can track the drawing of funds, the payments of those funds going out, what they were being used for, that it was allowable, that it was the appropriate amount on that, and then it follows all that overlay of applicable laws, rules, and regulations. So we talked about, eligible under CDBG, eligible under 2 CFR Part 200, being billed to the right grant, all of that are part of those fundamental requirements for your financial system. So I mentioned about internal controls, and this is making sure that we have staffing, that we have procedures in place to make sure that we've got oversight of each of these steps by essentially a second pair of hands. So we're making sure that things are being done correctly. So that's this separation of duty. And I certainly, I think one of the first local program administrator conferences I went to in Ohio when I was pretty young was there was a village clerk who was at that meeting with her resume, and she was looking for a job. And she had recently been released from jail because she had been found guilty of misappropriation of funds. And it was a scenario where she had pretty much complete control and there was nobody paying attention. That's obviously not a career builder, so we want to make sure that that never happens. Having these internal controls would be part of that. So internal controls might include things like not only laying out those procedures and who will look at what, but clearly defining job duties, responsibilities, those sort of secondary checks and balances on that. But they also include things like some people will have internal controls and policies that will say that each of these folks have to take a vacation from time to time. Why would that be? Well, in some cases you'll have someone that is very carefully managing and not having anyone else see what they are doing. And so those internal controls lay out some standards on those checks and balances. All right, so let's talk a little bit about accounting records. So as I mentioned, the most common audit finding that I used to see was where it was determined that we had a payment that had been made using CDBG funds, and there wasn't enough of a record there to determine, is this a CDBG related cost? Is it eligible, but then also is it related to a CDBG funded project? Is it the fair share on this? So we always need to be able to have additional records that can identify each of those uses of funding, what the source of funding was, how it was used, how it was eligible, how we decided that that was the right amount. And that would then allow you to be able to approve based on that criteria, that you would have budgetary controls in place. So that also would be including, okay, I've got a grant from DLG for this particular activity, and I have a budget of $800,000. I need to be able to show not only all of these expenses are eligible, that they were part of what we agreed to pay, but I need to be able to see, how are we doing? Is this, we've got an invoice in for $100,000. How much funding have we already drawn down? Is this something that was within the budget? So a process, budgetary control on this. And that's being done with cash receipts, having disbursements, journals and ledgers, charts of accounts. That chart of account is really big for grantees that then are operating multiple programs, multiple grants, to make sure that everything is being billed appropriately, that as money is coming in, you're electronically drawing down funds from DLG, that it's being credited to the right account, and then that we are making timely payments on that. So really critical that those systems are in place. So budgetary controls, as I mentioned, comparing those expenditures with the approved activity, making sure that we know what our balances are, what obligations we still have remaining that haven't been paid out, so that you know whether you are on budget and okay on that. And keep in mind, we're going to be talking about the fact that as a local grantee, you are responsible for overruns, cost overruns on projects. So it's really important to be able to track that and monitor that. So key here is source documentation. And as I've been talking about, explaining the basis of the cost, how it's related to the particular funding that you're wanting to draw that from, the dates of the expenditure. And then because you're going to be reimbursing, you're going to be drawing down funds for expenses that are already in place, we need to be able to then show that the bill has been paid. We've got the invoice, we have the canceled check. All of the documentation that's related to this would be available. And that would include things like payroll and timesheets. So, if my wages are being charged off to DLG work, I mean, today will be, much of my day will be charged off to DLG. We need to be able to document, how is that eligible? Was I actually working on this? And so needing to have timesheets for individual workers to not only show that they were there, but many folks will need to have a timesheet that will say, okay, I was working on this program at this point for a certain number of hours per day. I was working on other things for the balance of that. So all of that documentation needs to be collected and maintained in the file. Also, we need to be able to show, as money's coming in, we need to be able to have procedures in place that receipt those funds that are received. So we've drawn funds from DLG to reimburse for our CDBG program. We would be able to receipt and show that the money came in, it was drawn, it came in, it was receipted into the appropriate grant account. We're going to be talking specifically about program income and some other sources of funding on that. We need to make sure, and this would be important to know, that the individuals that are going to be doing this work we have bonding in place, that those receipts are going into the proper account, and that within our accounting system, we can track all of those, the sources coming in, the sources going out. So that cash receipts journal would be available to be able to document all of those transactions. Let's talk a little bit about bank accounts. And I guess I want to, some of this you will not be doing yourselves, but I think it's important to understand the process. So HUD at the federal level has funded CDBG. They've allocated, awarded a certain amount to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and then going through their DLG, going through their funding process has determined the amount of funding that you are going to receive. The concept here is that the money stays in that federal account until it is needed to reimburse for eligible expenses. So we have rules about that flow of money and the timing on that money. So first off, for your general accounts, for your CDBG funds that you are drawing down from DLG, it needs to be maintained in non-interest bearing bank accounts. So essentially, the federal government doesn't want you to draw down those funds, sit on them a little bit so that you can earn some funding off of that. They want any interest that's earned being at the federal level, not at the local level. So we have a rule of no excess cash over $5,000 for more than 5 days. And so we need to see that when you are receiving your funding from DLG, that then, in a timely manner, so we've got this 5-day rule, that you are making those payments. Sometimes that's a challenge at the local level, a county auditor that says, well, I want to do these, once a month or every 2 weeks. Keep in mind, we have a rule about no excess cash. So we need to be able to document that this is being followed. And that's something that an auditor would test for as part of that. Also, we're going to be talking about the fact that when you have program income and revolving loan funds, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes here, that those different set of rules, those are going to be kept in a separate account that's interest bearing. And any interest that's generated is going to be returned to GLG and then have to go back to the Treasury. And essentially, again, the federal government wants to see that if there is, if there are payments that are coming back to the grantee or maybe a subrecipient, if they're generating income off of that, that's not necessarily a bad thing for program income and revolving funds, but you're not going to benefit from it. It gets returned back to the Treasury. All right, so let's talk about some of the required forms. So when Andalyn talked through the evidentiary materials at the beginning this morning, a couple of these are things that she referenced, and I'll just talk a little bit more about them. So the authorized signature form. So when you are submitting a request for funds from DLG, they're going to be looking at those requests and looking at the signatures that are on those request forms to make sure that the people who have signed this document have actually been authorized to be able to sign those documents, reports, draw requests as part of that. And so that form needs to be signed by the CEO of the jurisdiction. They're going to designate who is authorized to be able to do this. And so as requests, reports, other things come in, DLG would be comparing the signature that are on whatever's been submitted to what's on their official authorized signature form, and they would be rejecting a form that was not signed by one of those individuals. So having that authorized signature form as part of the evidentiary materials at the beginning of that grant is ensuring that at least at that point we have current signatures. But keep in mind, as you have turnover or changes in duties, you need to make sure that the authorized signature form gets updated so that it is not holding that up. I don't know if there's a limit on the number of signatories. I think you could look at the form itself on that, but usually you're going to have a couple of alternatives so that if you have someone who's out of the office, that you would, things wouldn't come to a halt while that was happening. The other form here is the direct electronic transfer of funds form. So funds are going to be electronically deposited into that non-interest bearing account. that we talked about. And so that form needs to be in place as part of the evidentiary information. So let's talk a little bit more about allowable costs. So, I mentioned that we have some things that CDBG regulations or 2 CFR might say you can never do. But in addition to that, we always have to know, and this would be important to remember, that those costs have to be reasonable, and we'll talk through these, allowability of cost, and then allocability. So cost reasonable, and I'll use maybe the easy. Well, let's talk about economic development rather than housing, because we're doing more of that, I think, with our regular CDBG funds. So in all cases, when you are using federal dollars, we have to be able to show that this is a reasonable amount to pay for this. Based on what it is that we're paying for, what would a prudent person pay for that? So, we have some bad press sort of things, the Pentagon paying, for a golden toilet seat. I think those are probably apocryphal things, but there was a muffin scandal maybe about 10 years ago where there was some kind of a federal conference and the cost per muffin was determined to be, I think, $10 or more on that. So there's a question of how do we document cost reasonableness? We're going to be talking about procurement. So in some cases, we will be requiring that folks go through procurement. They're going to get bidders on this. They're going to evaluate this. And that's how we document that, okay, that was a reasonable price to pay for this. But in other cases, let's say we are doing an economic development project and the company themselves is going to be receiving assistance. They're going to be purchasing, I don't know, some kind of a boiler system and smokestack. They're not triggering the federal and state procurement requirements because they're exempt from that, but we still need to be able to evaluate, should this actually cost, $500,000 versus $1 million? And so you could be questioned on the expenditure of the CDBG funds if you can't show that you had some methodology of evaluating that. So procurement covers that part of the time. In other cases, we're looking at, what does a similar item generally cost? In some cases, we will be asking, like when it's some kind of specialized thing with economic development, we might be asking them to provide us some information about what are the alternatives here, options for this, and some cost information so that you're able to document that. So allowability has to do with, is this something that I can use CDBG funds for? So that refers to the regulations themselves, also going to 2 CFR, which is requiring on that. And then keep in mind that your grant agreement has specifically called out what are the CDBG funds being able to be used on that. So Jennifer raises a really good point here. I just got a little chat. So one of the key things to remember here is that what's going to be eligible is based on either you are drawing money for a need or which really generally we're going to be drawing money to reimburse for a cost that we've incurred that cost, and we are going to then be paying that cost. We have an invoice for this. You're not able to, it would be nice to be able to say, I'd like to get, and some programs would allow you to say, well, let's draw down 20% of our grant amount and let's just keep it in that local account so that as invoices come in, we can just draw that money very quickly and we don't have to, wait for any turnaround time on this. That is not allowable under CDBG. The funds are being drawn in anticipation or at the point we've incurred that cost, and we're going to be reimbursed for that. So we can't do any advanced payments for that. So that would not be an allowable draw on this. And then we mentioned about allocability. So some of these costs are going to be shared costs, and so they need to be allocated and determining what's what's the portion that's going to be eligible. So your financial record should show, how did I decide what portion of my, the copier expenses, there were 1,000 copies made last month. Some of them were for this program, some were for another. Do I have a methodology? So I might have a code that I'm putting in, or I've determined that, a employee is spending 50% of their time working on one program, 50% on another. There would be a methodology on how you allocated those costs. That's part of your process of documenting that it was eligible. So with that, let's talk about administrative costs, because that's a great example of costs that oftentimes have to be kind of divvied up. So admin costs are the costs that are related to implementing that CDBG grant. So we have project costs that are, they might be the bricks and sticks sort of costs for doing whatever that activity is doing, but the labor hours and related costs, maybe the office space, the copier, things that we've been talking about, those are related to that grant implementation. And so those come under, they're eligible as an administrative cost. So again, we have to be able to document, we're going to categorize this as an administrative cost because we can describe what's that cost related to, and then how do we back up what that cost was. So timesheets that we mentioned, invoices, purchase orders, other receipts, to be able to show that this is why I determined that this was eligible, and this is the amount, how I justified the amount for this. All of that documentation would need to be in place to document this as an eligible cost. You would not be processing and reimbursing that cost without that. If you did, that's one of the things that an auditor will be looking at and may, as they sample, see that and say, wait a minute, you can't document that this was an eligible cost. You can't demonstrate that it's reasonable, and so I'm going to question that cost, and you might have to make a repayment on that. Matching funds. So your grant agreement is going to contain information about matching funds that were as part of your application. This is documenting other funds that you said that we can bring to the table for this particular activity. The good news for CDBG, and this is one of the things that, when members of Congress are saying, well, why do we have to give all this money to CDBG? We not only want to be able to say, look, these are all the important things that are being done in your local communities, but also part of the good news is that you are bringing additional local dollars, other non-federal dollars to the table. And so we are tracking those. Those are being reported on, and GLG will be reporting those to HUD. So when HUD goes to Congress with that, budgetary hearings, and they're being asked about the CDBG budget, they're able to say, look, for every dollar of CDBG funds that you, Congress, approve for this program, we're bringing in, this number of dollars to make an impact on that local community. So we need to have those tracked and reported and have the documentation in place to show that, yes, those dollars were actually reported here. So we had a question about federally approved indirect cost rates and how they get applied. So we probably don't see this in smaller communities, but I certainly worked with those at the federal level, and you probably would see those maybe in a large city or a larger county where you have a indirect cost plan that has an approved indirect cost rate. So we have a pool of indirect costs, and I'll just use the example of when I was at the state level. Within that cost pool were all of our space costs, so the rent for the space that we occupied, but it also included our share of paying for like the pool of cars that we used to travel around in, legal services, personnel, our finance department was part of that. So your indirect cost plan would identify all of these costs, all these indirect costs that are being pooled together, and then based on that approved rate, the determination would be made that, you know, this portion of that, these costs are going to be attributable to your office and would be paid then out of your admin fund. So anything that is identified as an indirect cost can never be billed towards the project because it's by definition being indirect. It's not directly related to a project. So that does need to be billed to admin. And for this, for a federally approved indirect cost rate, for each source of funding, there would be a cognizant federal agency that would have to approve that rate. And so you end up having, I think, a conditional rate, and then you get, I think, on an annual basis, a new rate that is being applied to that. And they would be reevaluating those cost pools and changing those indirect cost rates over time. So we probably don't see a lot of that, but those costs do need to be billed to the admin. And you would need to have, if you have that an indirect cost plan in place, you need that documentation to show that you had an approved rate and that you were billing based on that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about asset management. So, and we see this in a number of ways with the CDBG program. So sometimes we will have CDBG funds that have been used to purchase and hold real property. And so if that's the case, we need to have an updated inventory that would be done on a biannual basis. And we're going to be talking much later in this training about change of use. And so we have this issue about if we have CDBG funds that have been used for real property, then there's this issue of if it fails to continue to meet that national objective over time, then money has to either be repaid or we have to show that we found a new use that meets a national objective. And so this time frame would be that we need to be able to track those assets throughout that use period to make sure that it continues to meet that national objective. We also would have things like personal property. So, you know, we may have computers, other equipment that would be part of that. So these are fixed assets that would be tracked on a ledger. And so we need to be able to, we need to have processes in place that would deal with loss, damage, or theft. That would also include disposition of that property. So a lot of grantees you will find at the city or the county level are going to have procedures in place that may have to do with not only, you know, what's the useful life of certain types of equipment, what's your disposition plan on this. And so, you know, you might have a specific policy for computer equipment versus, you know, an automobile or those sorts of things. And so that needs to be documented. I worked in we will talk about reversion of assets at some point, but sometimes we will see where CDBG funds have been used in conjunction with maybe a subrecipient, and they've purchased a piece of equipment. They stop functioning as a subrecipient, and we might need to be able to pull back that personal property or real property or demand payment on that. So having this asset management process in place will be important. So our CDBG change of use. So let's say I have used my CDBG funds and I have used it to purchase let's say I purchased a former school building and I'm going to use it as a community center. And the way I've been able to qualify this activity was as an area benefit. So, you know, maybe I'm doing some kind of, I've got classrooms and I'm going to be doing some computer classes or financial literacy. Maybe I have a theater auditorium, so I'm going to do some kind of community theater, and I'm showing that my service area is this particular subset of the community, and I've been able to compare to my census information to document that this is an LMI area. And so that's how my use of those CDBG funds are made eligible. But I need to continue to meet that national objective for at least 5 years from that purchase, or the funds have to be repaid. So it's one of the reasons that, if I had someone coming to me asking for this community center, I would be asking a lot of questions about, okay, so, how will you staff this? How will you pay your operating costs? Is this a viable concept so that we have some confidence that for at least 5 years, you're going to be able to continue to meet that national objective, or those funds would have to be repaid. And so the rule would be that if, and I'll use an example, had a community that was using a building for a senior center, and during that use period, there was a lot of redevelopment in that area, and essentially the LMI community that they have been supporting with that center was no longer there. And so they closed down that senior center. It moved somewhere else to a different building. So because that building was purchased with or improved with CDBG funds, there was a national objective that had to be met for a 5-year period. So either they could find a new use, and maybe in this case you'd say, well, I now have renters, I've got a lot of young children in this area, we do have income eligible families. Let's reuse this building as a daycare center, and we could meet a national objective based on who was being assisted. And so in that case, we could continue with a change of use that was approved. We could show that we're going to meet that 5-year time period because we have found another eligible use. In the absence of finding another eligible use and completing that 5 years, those funds will have to be repaid. And so we're going to be paying based on the current value of that property. So if we gave them $100,000 to purchase this property, and now because what's happened in that area, it's now worth $200,000, it's the current value that would have to be repaid. Now that may seem like a hardship, but it's also a saving grace. If you expended $100,000, we need to sell that property, and now values have gone down and it's only worth $50,000. I'm using small numbers that are easy to deal with. But in that case, then what's required to be repaid at that current value would only be that sale price of $50,000. And so you're not, having to find other funds to be able to make that whole. So change of use, an important thing. I would make a note of that. Maybe look in the handbook a little bit at change of use, just as a refresher on that, so you're kind of clear on that. And so in some of your grant agreements, you will see that you have certain activities that have a change of use provision that will need to be in place. All right, so let's talk about funds that are earned from CDBG funds.
We've got it in the chat that the handbook says that it's 100,000, but the slide says 150.
Aha, we will make that correction. I don't believe that there's been a change in the regulation, so I believe the handbook is correct, but we will double check that. All right, so let's talk about program income and miscellaneous revenue. So when we talk about program income, this is money that's coming back to the grantee or the subrecipient. So if you, let's say you are a county program and you have, let's say you've done a septic system replacement program and you did this as a loan. And so folks are going to be making payments that are coming back to either the grantee or the subrecipient. So that's payments that are coming back from an eligible activity. It met a national objective. So we've had an eligible use of our funds, but these are funds coming back. Those funds that are coming back are going to be categorized as program income. And we're going to look at the gross amount that's being received by the grantee or the subrecipient. If it was coming back to DLG, it would be considered program income. And because it is considered program income means that it maintains its federal identity. And so you may well be asked some questions about program income. I would be putting a big star on this slide. I would be thinking about and listening carefully to this. So because it is maintaining its federal identity, it means that when you use that program income that's come into you, that you have to then find another eligible CDBG use, you have to meet a national objective, all of the federal requirements that apply that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days are going to apply to this. So environmental review and Davis-Bacon requirements, all of that are going to apply to these funds. So we have to follow the same procedures as part of, as you did when you originally were implementing those funds. So those funds need to be receipted into your system. So they would go into your program income account, and they have to be expended first. So when we talk about our draw request form, and if you look at the, I don't know where I put that, if you look at the sample forms, there is a sample request for payment form. On that form, you will see that there's a question asking you if there's been any program income that's been receipted since that last draw. So let's say I am going to be sending in a draw request for $200,000 for my sewer line installation project. But since my last draw, I received $20,000 in program income. I am going to reflect that on my draw request form. So I need to draw $200,000. I'm reporting that I received $20,000 in program income. And so that's going to reduce the amount of draw that's going to by that program income amount. So we're only going to be drawing $180,000, and we're going to be expending that $20,000 in program income right away as part of this next draw request. You're not allowed to have program income that's going to sit in your account. It has to be expended before drawing money that's coming out of the federal treasury. And you know, the kind of the key theme here is we're holding the fund money at the federal level till the last minute, and you can't have money that's sitting at the local level. So it holds its federal identity. It has to be expended first, and it's going to be reported on your payment form and tracked in that way. So that's program income. But we also have sort of a carve out within the regulations for what we call miscellaneous revenue. And I think we have, when we get just a little bit further on, we've got a slide about miscellaneous revenue on this. But essentially, these funds are not going to be considered to be program income. And so they don't hold their federal identity. And the only minimal conditions is that they would be benefiting LMI individuals. So they could be used to support your program operations. And so we're going to be talking about your responsibilities on how you use these, when you need to receive permission for that. So that's what we're going to launch into. So let's first talk about program income. So program income are, any of these sources, which we don't see a lot of under CDBG, and particularly in the programs that you're operating, other than we do see quite a bit of this under economic development, where these are being made as loans to a private company. And we'll talk more about, because there's sort of a different way that some of that is being handled. So, if we had sale of an asset that we have those monies being repaid, or some kind of leasing rental amounts that were coming back to that, And that would include, we'll use the example under economic development. If we had an economic development loan to a frozen pizza company, and they are going to be paying, making $1,000 payment every month, 800 of that is principal, 200 of that is interest. That principal and interest is going to be considered program income. If we had a revolving loan fund, and we'll talk about what they are in a moment, any interest from that revolving loan fund would be considered program income. And then if we had recaptured funds, so somehow we had funds that turned out to be an ineligible use and they were pulled back, but we hadn't disposed of them yet, if there was interest being earned on those would also be included in that. We're going to talk about special assessments. So I'm just very briefly going to use the example of if we were doing, let's say we did a sidewalk project in a community, and we used the CDBG funds to pay for the sidewalks in front of our LMI households. But we did a special assessment and we made all of the other non-LMI households pay in for the linear feet of sidewalk in front of their house. We would have money that was coming in for that special assessment. If it was coming in after the fact, so we paid for the project and we now were being reimbursed from those non-LMI owners, that's going to be considered program income. Not to complicate matters, but if we had them pay in advance, because we talked about program income as money that's as a result of a project that has met a national objective, those funds would be collected to pay for that portion, but it's not considered program income. I don't think there's a test question on that, so don't stress too much about that. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there are more examples in the handbook about types of program income, but really the most common is going to be some kind of loan where there is a payment that's being made, or maybe we have, if you had a housing program that had an affordability period that said, if you sell or transfer that property prior to the end of the affordability period, all or some of our money has to be paid back. That would be an example of program income. So here's our exceptions to that. And this is when we talk about miscellaneous revenue. So what the regulations say is that if you had less than $35,000 coming in a single year, and this is earned from your CDBG expenditures, that you don't have to deal with this as program income, but we're going to call this miscellaneous revenue. So we've got small little amounts coming in. It's under this $35,000 amount, and that means that because we're able to count this as miscellaneous revenue, it does not hold its federal identity. So having to be used for another eligible CDBG activity, doing an environmental review, all those things that go with that being categorized as CDBG funds. If it fits with this miscellaneous revenue category, it's exempt from that. Now, the key is that this is within a single year. So you're really not going to know until the end of the year whether you're going to end up with $35,000 or more. So you really wouldn't dare take that miscellaneous revenue and expend it on something that was not meeting all the program income requirements, in November, thinking that, well, this is great, I've got miscellaneous revenue, and then find on, almost the last day of the year, you get a payment that comes in the door, and suddenly that cumulative total goes over the $35,000, and now all of that money that came in during that year, because the cumulative total is $35,000 or more, now has to follow the CDBG rules, eligible activity, all of the overlay of other federal. And so some grantees will say, we're just going to count everything that comes in the door as program income and not need to be carefully calculating this. Others will hold on to it and wait to see at the end of that year whether it's going to be below that $35,000 threshold. So that threshold would be important to understand. Also, the concept of its non-federal dollars would be really important to keep in mind on that. The other, and this is the sort of the other flexibility that we see for economic development projects. So within the entitlement regulations, so there are regulations for entitlements and there are regulations for the state. The entitlement regulations have a lot more detail. And so within the entitlement regulations, there's more detail about this exemption for 105A15 organizations. So these are essentially organizations that are, working at the community level. And so what DLG has done is use that flexibility to essentially create a category for organizations that qualify as a local development agency, an LDA, that this fits within this A15-105 exemption. And so monies that are going back to that LDA would be exempt from this. So let's give the example that we have a county that makes the loan to the frozen pizza company. And the frozen pizza company, as part of their agreement, is making their payment not to the county, but is making it to the local development agency. And so the funds, because they're coming to the LDA, can qualify for this exemption. And so they are not categorized as program income. They don't have the overlay of all the other federal regulations, the CDBG regulations. So it makes those funds more flexible. So we're going to be talking about, for those funds that are being received by the LDA, what are those rules that apply? Now, one of the things I just want to point out here is we've had some cases where the money was paid to the county. And so we said, well, anything that goes back to the grantee, county, is going to be program income. So that money can't be later transferred to the LDA and say, oh, well, it's exempt because we've handed it off. If it came to the grantee or it came to the subrecipient, it is program income and has to follow those regulations. So this only works when the payments are going directly to the LDA. We also have had some counties, I believe, that said, well, we want the LDA to transfer some of these funds back to the county. If they do that, now the funds have been repaid to the county. The county then, these funds are now going to be program income. So we need to be sure that these are funds that have gone directly to the LDA and that they're being maintained and implemented by the LDA to be able to work within this exemption. And there is more information in the handbook specifically on this. So another flexibility that's included in the CDBG regulations, this is something that's unique to CDBG, is that we have a category, sort of a subset of program income that are revolving loan funds. So I said with program income, if we get any program income, we have to spend it right away. We can't hold on to it. We can't kind of set it aside to try to build up for some particular project we hope to be able to do. So the CDBG regulations allow a grantee to be able to set up a revolving loan fund. So this is a separate fund that's been established for a particular type of activity. So for instance, I had communities, I'll use the best example I can think of, had communities that had a septic system replacement program that they were running. And those were made on, I think, interest-free loans, and they were being paid over quite a period of time to make it affordable for low-income households. When your septic system has to be replaced, that can be a pretty sizable cost. I had to replace the septic system with my father's house to be able to sell it when he passed away, when it was tested and found to have a crack. And so I think that was like $22,000. So for a low-income person, that leaves them not being able to address this. So this community was funding septic system replacements, and they were done as zero interest loans, and the payments were then going to, they established a revolving loan fund specifically for an ongoing septic system program. So those funds, because they've been designated for a revolving loan fund, instead of being in that program income pool and being required to be expended right away, were able to be put into this revolving loan fund and used only for septic replacement activities. And so able to have those funds regenerate over time. And so they always, because they had quite a portfolio that they had funded directly and then they had loan payments coming back in, they were able to do at some point almost a self-supporting program because they had funds coming in from these payments on a regular basis, enough to be able to make new loans to new individuals and have all this stream of payments coming back in. So it needs to have a very specific purpose, could be housing rehab, could be an economic development revolving loan fund, could be something like I was referencing with the septic system replacement. And so those payments, even though they are considered program income, they are follow the revolving loan fund rule. So they are triggering the other federal requirements, but the big thing is they don't have to be expended first. Now you'll notice that the name is revolving funds. So where HUD and DLG would have concerns would be if those funds aren't then being reused. So if you had a revolving loan fund program, and part of the requirements on this is to have an approved program that lays out how that process is going to be run, what's going to be eligible, how you're going to market that, but looking to make sure that those funds aren't just sitting, but we are seeing new loans being made, new assistance being provided. So as part of that, you have to have written guidelines in place. DLG will need to review and approve those. And so that's really calling out what's the purpose of these revolving funds specifically, what are we trying to address? What are all the eligibility requirements? How will we market this? What's my process on determining the amount, selecting folks that are going to be receiving assistance in that approval process, and then the operations and management on that. So, it's essentially a plan of action. It's a transparent plan on, how that's going to be used. And DLG would need to review and approve that prior to being able to do that. So there are sample guidelines that are provided in the handbook. This would also apply to a subrecipient. So if a county had a subrecipient they were working with who was going to wanted to establish a revolving loan fund, they would need to go through this same process, have DLG's approval before they were able to work with that. All right, so let's talk about the process when we're using these funds. So for using program income, we talked about the fact it has to be used, and again, this is an important topic. I'd be making a little mark here, paying kind of attention to this, maybe reviewing this. So with program income, we know that it holds its federal identity. So that means being an eligible activity, meeting a national objective, one of the 3 national objective categories that Andelin talked about of slum and blight, urgent need, or LMI. It would need to meet one of those eligible national objectives. And it has to be, program income, as we talked about, has to be expended prior to drawing additional CDBG funds. So we talked about on the draw request form that you're reporting any program income that's been received since that last draw, so that we're making sure that it's getting expended right away. And then tracking to make sure that all of the federal regulations, the CDBG regulations, are being followed for that. That would be part of your monitoring and oversight of this. It's something that DLG would be looking at. It's also something that HUD would be testing to sample some of those projects and make sure. Now, recognizing that with program income coming in, because it's a reuse of this funding and you're having to, meet all of these same requirements, there's some administrative burden to this. And so the regulations allow the grantee to expend up to 20% of that program income that's been receipted for administration. So understanding that, okay, I've got money coming back in for this new activity. I'm going to have to do an environmental review, and I'm going to have to make sure that Davis-Bacon is followed and fair housing, whatever that overlay of CDBG and other federal regulations. There's some due diligence on this that will have to be done by the grantee. And so that's a recognition that the ability to pull up to 20% of that for admin is something that the rules allow, something important to remember. All right, so when you have a use for program income, again, it has to be used before requesting additional KCDBG dollars. It's usually simply used as part of that draw request. You need to request permission to expend that. And so there is a form, attachment 3-5. Might want to make a note of that. Take a look at that in the attachment list for this chapter, and you're essentially certifying the use on this, that it's eligible. As part of that, DLG would be reviewing that request. And that also applies for miscellaneous revenue. So you do need to, for miscellaneous revenue, make a written request to DLG about how you intend to use that. So DLG is going to verify that, yes, this actually does qualify as miscellaneous revenue, to make sure that you're not inadvertently thinking that it doesn't hold its federal identity when actually it does. We want to make sure everything's going to be in compliance on that, and they're going to want to know about the use that you were proposed for this. So there is some ongoing reporting on this. So there is a repayment report. It's submitted twice a year in June and December. We have a report form that is specifically used for that. And that's not only for program income, but also on the miscellaneous revenue report as part of that. And keep in mind, if you, let's say I'm a county and I have a subrecipient that's administering a program on my behalf, and they have established they're receiving program income, we need to make sure that that is being reported, that you as the grantee are collecting that information, reporting it on your draw request, making that adjustment, making sure that those funds are being expended prior to drawing other federal dollars. If it's a revolving loan fund, that they've got an approved plan in place, DLG has reviewed and approved that, and then they're making, following the request requirements for the use of that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about payment procedures. So as Jennifer pointed out, really key element of this, payments are at the point you're eligible to draw funding. Not only have you completed upfront, we talked about all the evidentiary materials needing to be in place, the environmental review having been completed and that release of funds in place, but we also need to make sure that we have an eligible activity, that we've got all the documentation we've talked about in our financial system. So as part of our payment procedures, we need to have, you as the grantee need to have a deadline in place for submission of invoices and vouchers. And be clear on also the documentation you would expect to be submitted with that. You're only able to request the amount of funds that needs to be paid for immediate obligations. So you've got an invoice that's been submitted for, you've got a road project, you've got a sewer treatment plant, and you've got a public service activity. You're going to have a voucher that's going to draw those funds that are now due for reimbursement. You aren't able to draw, a pile of money to have it sit locally in your account. So DLG is processing those payment requests twice a month. So you need to get your request for payment to DLG by the 3rd and the 18th of each month. So thinking about what your procedures are going to be in establishing a deadline, obviously they would need to be the deadline for submission of invoices and vouchers from any of your vendors needs to be a few days in advance of that so that you have the time to be able to review those, make sure that they are correct, make sure that they line up with the budget, that you've got the appropriate documentation in place before you're submitting that. Jennifer, want to add?
Yes, please. I know everyone knows, or most everyone knows, that that's the standard rules for our regular CDBG. But as we move forward into disaster recovery, and this stands for CDBG as well, because I know a gentleman just sent in a draw request the other day, and it was such a big request that I asked if he needed me to do a special processing. We will do those. We're available to do those at any time. So I just want to keep everyone to keep that in mind, that if you've got something and the city or the county cannot afford, to wait, it needs to be paid right now. We will work with you to get that done. So please just keep that in mind as you go forward. But we do try to stick to these two rules right here, just because it makes everything on an even keel basis. It doesn't drive us crazy to try to do it, but we will do what we need to process payments.
Great. So your goal generally is to have your system organized so that those invoices are coming to DLG within these windows, but keep in mind that there are cases where something needs to be processed outside of that and that you can request that. Perfect. Glad you added that. All right. So we mentioned about the payment completion form, and I would maybe make a little star or a note on this. So that's attachment 3-2 that I mentioned earlier. That's where I was referencing that you would be including information about program income that have been received since that last draw. So the 5 sections of this form, you could be asked about that, would be, you're obviously identifying the specific grant that these funds are being drawn from, and information about what's the current status of those funds, what's been drawn to date, what's the cash requirement that you have at this point that you're trying to draw, and that would include that information about program income that you'd received, but also it requires information about what's the status of this project. You're signing off on certifying on that, and that would be submitted as part of your payment request with appropriate backup documentation with that. So these are the 5 sections. That's the form 3-2. If you've not seen that form, I would recommend that you take a look at that as part of that. So I mentioned a little bit about audits, and I kind of want to talk a little bit further about this. So we mentioned the 2 CFR Part 200, which is kind of an important regulation to be familiar with. This is our federal circular that lays out our procurement, our financial systems, and our audit requirements on this. So the federal audit requirements, and they've changed over time. Currently, the federal audit requirement to trigger the requirement of a single audit is going to be for grantees or subrecipients that have expended. This is not, the size of the grant that I got this year that maybe I'm going to expend over a couple of years. This is what I've actually expended in this fiscal period. So if it's more than $750,000, then that triggers the single agency audit requirement. So some of you may say, well, I'm kind of familiar with this, and our agency, because of the amount of funding that we're generally receiving, we don't really trigger the single audit requirement. Keep in mind that it is based on your overall federal award, so it's not limited to just CDBG, but also even within the CDBG category, we in recent time have had the CDBG CV funding, the COVID funding. We've also had disaster funding as part of this. So some of you may, based on those additional funds that have been received, may find that you're in a period where you are going to be triggering that single audit when in the past you have not. So one of those things is they're expensive. And so making sure that you are budgeting for those programs. And again, it would be an allocability on this. So, your 2022 CDBG funds, that grant, a portion of that single audit would be part of your admin cost for that, but some of it would be by all these other funding sources that are triggering that. So it's not limited just to CDBG. You would be having an auditor that's going to conduct that audit. And essentially the single audit, they're looking at all funds for that agency, all programs, and it's following the standards and procedures that are in place as part of 2 CFR Part 200. And it's really meant to, the higher the dollar figure, essentially the higher the risk on this. So it's taking an agency-wide look at your financial systems, on sampling on files to make sure that this is operating correctly. So that's our single agency audit. The trigger is $750,000. I would want to know that. All right, so let's talk about what that audit report provides you and what needs to be done as part of that. So at the completion of the audit report, there'll be a report that will talk about, what was the scope of what they looked at. There will be an analysis of your financial systems, and they'll talk about any weaknesses that they saw as part of that. They'll be looking at things like internal controls that we talked about. They'll be looking at compliance with not only 2 CFR Part 200 requirements on what's eligible, what's allocable, cost reasonableness, but they would also be looking at the CDBG requirements, the 570 requirements on this to determine whether they felt that each of these expenditures that they sampled met those requirements and were allowable and had appropriate documentation as part of that. So they'll be sampling those transactions. There'll be a schedule of findings or question cost. And so that's where, you would often see, well, there was a $100,000 transaction. We don't see enough documentation to be able to deem whether this is eligible or not. And so this is a question cost, and it would be questioned and could require repayment unless you were able to respond to that audit finding, provide the additional information. Oftentimes at the state level was being asked to provide and verify information to the auditor to say, yes, this was acceptable. Yes, this met our program requirements, to help them close that. And so that audit report will have a summary of what their findings were. Hopefully they're going to say, we found that you have really good financial systems. Everything seems to be followed. We didn't have any findings or question cost for that. So the submission requirements on this are pretty specific. And again, I might want to be able to reference this. So this is the responsibility of the grantee. So you as a grant administrator are going to need to know this. So the federal requirements on this, that the audit has to be completed within 9 months of the end of the fiscal year. So you've got a timetable on this. Keep in mind that you may need to go through procurement for the auditor. So you need to plan ahead to make sure that you have an auditor in place to be able to complete that, so that once you hit the end of the fiscal year, you're ready to get that started. It must be then submitted within 30 days of that report, or March 31st, whichever is earlier. And that goes to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, but also a copy gets sent to DLG's Office of Federal Grants as part of that. And when we get to talking about the closeout on your grants, one of the things that will be looked at was, are there any issues that were identified in this audit? Have they all been handled by that? Jennifer. Go ahead.
I needed to unmute myself. I just wanted, even though you call it out to send a copy to DLG Office of Federal Grant, I just want everybody to make sure that they understand that DLG is nothing related to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. That is a totally separate submission that they're required to do on their own. Just because they submit it to DLG does not mean that they meet that requirement.
Good point. Yeah, Jennifer is not collecting these and then sending them off on your behalf.
Correct.
All right. So those are the federal audit requirements, and these go back to 2 CFR Part 200. But we also have state audit requirements, and this would be typical, I think, in every state. So the KRS regulations, you can find them at 91A, and that applies to, let's first talk about cities and then we'll talk about counties. So if the city has a population of less than 2,000, then we have a rule about every other year being completed by October 1st. Odd years, they're going to complete a 2-year audit by March 1st. So that's for based on population. And then cities that are expending less than $75,000 and have no long-term general obligations or revenue debt aren't required to have an audit, but there is a financial statement that needs to be submitted. So, you as a community would need to know, what as a city, what are my requirements here, and am I under this $75,000 category, meeting this criteria to simply do a financial statement. Counties have a separate standard. They're required to have an audit done after the end of every fiscal year. Of course, because counties are generally going to be a much larger entity, more revenue flowing through that. All right, these would be, again, I think important things to be able to look back up if you were asked a question. You could go out to dinner next week and somebody's going to say to you, hey, I've always wondered about the federal and state audit requirements, and you're going to be able to impress your friends and family by being able to spit out that information. All right, so mentioned about for the city audits, they're completed by March 10th, following the close of the fiscal year. We have to publish an ad concerning that audit within 30 days of its presentation to the city legislative body. So the city legislative body would have a chance to review that and approve that, and then that's going to be submitted in electronic copy to DLG's City and Special Districts branch and to the federal grant. So again, DLG is not handling the federal responsibilities on this. So depending on whether it's the cities and special district branch or the federal grants office, you will need to handle completing that. And then the county auditors, county audits are being performed by the state auditors. They're going to be done within a reasonable time frame. And there's some KRS guidance on that. And those reports then are going to go to the governor, attorney general, and also will go to DLG. And I would presume, Jennifer, I'm going to presume that you guys get asked to comment on some of these findings, like if we have a county that responds back to a finding or concern that you might be weighing in on some of these.
Actually, I don't think that I've ever seen us get a question like that.
Okay.
But now every once in a while we are contacted by maybe a CPA firm or someone that is conducting the audit and ask us certain questions then. But as far as like the findings or those kinds of things, unless it's on one of our programs, I guess maybe if it was specific the CDBG or something like that, they might ask us, but.
Well, it's probably that because you have certified grants administrators that you're not having those problems.
we don't get very many of those. Now, I
That's
will
good.
see a lot of issues on internal control, separation of duties, that kind of stuff out there on their regular business. But when it comes to major programs, we don't usually see too many too many questionable items.
That's good. That's how it should be. I will say I've seen examples where, and this was with a nonprofit rather than a unit of local government, where an auditor would say, we consider this to be inaudible because there was such a lack of a system in place. And what that would mean would be, we're questioning all of your costs. So, all of this talk about making sure you have policies and procedures and separation of duty, and you're using the documentation forms, the grant, accounts tracking is all to make sure that when you're being audited, that they can recreate where funds were used, how they were used, why they were eligible, and be able to then agree with your conclusion that things were acceptable on that. So that's our goal on this. And then you'll see the last bullet point here. The corridor county officials are required to then send the report to the newspaper and the transmittal to be published. So, Andelin talked about doing 2 public hearings. At the beginning, where we're talking about how we intend to use funds, and at the end, kind of reporting back to the community on here's what I did with these funds, here's who I assisted, here was the outcome. So there's this public transparency part of this requirement that also includes on the fact that there's an audit that's been done, and the public has the right that they could ask to view that report. All right.
Hey, Les,
Yes.
I was just informed that DLG does get some comments on some audits. They just don't come back here to me. Or to
That's
federal
lucky.
grants. They go to the commissioner's office. So I
Okay.
guess they're handled up front. But like I said, I answer for back here. I don't see them, so.
Good.
But I've been told that we do get, because we do have the county's branch up here that oversees county budgets and stuff. So.
Perfect. All right. So that gets us through the material that we have scheduled to go before lunch, and we are just about at 1:15. So I don't think it makes sense. We're not early enough that it would make sense to launch into the next chapter on procurement for a short while. So I think we'll go ahead and break for lunch. I don't see any questions or chat things that we need to respond to at the moment. So I'm going to have us go ahead and break for lunch, and we will be starting at 1:15 and starting with procurement, which is another really important topic, might be something that you'll want to pay particular attention to. So get something to eat, take a break, do some jumping jacks or something, and we'll be back at 1:15. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.